Kia ora tātou, good morning all and welcome to this ANZ webinar. I'm Lorraine Mapu, I'm the Managing Director of Business at ANZ New Zealand. One of our priorities is to deliver timely expertise and insights to support Kiwi businesses to build and grow strong, sustainable businesses. Today I'm delighted to be joined by two experts at ANZ, our Chief Economist, Sharon Zollner, and our ESG Specialist, Steve Dixon. It's been a really eventful month or so, alongside, I think, a really dynamic economic backdrop. We had Budget 2022 and the first emissions reduction plan released in May. Our focus today is to look at the current economic environment and then unpack for you the key initiatives from the emissions reduction plan, how these may impact particular sectors and how businesses can best prepare for these opportunities. But before we get into it, I just want to cover off a couple of quick housekeeping matters for today. So the session's going to run till around 10:15 a.m. It's been recorded, so just in case you miss anything, we'll follow up with a link to the recording. And if you have any questions, please enter it via the chat function at any time during the webcast. So it will be visible only to our webcast presenters. If you have any trouble accessing chat, raise your hand and one of our team will help you out. We'll get as many questions as we can towards the end of today's session. So look, let's get underway. And look, we'll start with Sharon to set the current. Sharon, I think there's a lot dominating broader economic headlines right now. Rising interest rates, inflation, geopolitical turmoil, and continued supply chain disruption. So it'd be great to get your views on the global picture.
Thanks, Lorraine. Yeah, no, it is a pretty challenging environment. And indeed, I think the challenge, one of the big challenges policymakers at the moment is to try and balance up near-term considerations and risks with the longer-term picture. At the moment, that's all about inflation, but climate change targets would be another one. I'm sure the Labour government didn't really want to cut the tax on carbon-based fuels, for example, but the cost of living crisis is very real, and those trade-offs between short-term and long-term goals are just feeling particularly pointed at the moment. I guess when COVID first hit, people thought, most economists thought it was going to be a really, really long-lasting shock to confidence and spending, and that we were at risk of a depression. So monetary and fiscal policy really needed to encourage people to take a bit more risk, borrow a bit more money, buy another house. But in practice, of course, that confidence shock was quite short-lived, and demand bounced back very quickly, while the supply side shock to the economy, to supply chains, and the like, was very long-running. So a lot of demand and hampered supply has, of course, now with hindsight, resulted in an awful lot of inflation pressure, and it's really caught central banks on the hop. So just overnight, just a couple of hours ago, the US Federal Reserve raised their policy rate by 75 basis points. So that's a triple hike. So, 50 was the new 25. Well, now it seems that 75 is the new 50. They haven't raised interest rates by that much in one hit since 1994. And that's because their inflation came in at 8.6%, much higher than expected, and also incredibly broad-based. So, and they raised rates 75 basis points after an extremely rough week for markets. Equities had a terrible time. Bitcoin did as well. It's risk off, as they say. Basically, not quite panic mode, but certainly some serious wobbles going on in financial markets. So for the central banks to be hiking rates aggressively in the face of that is quite something. And here in New Zealand, the equivalent is that house prices have fallen for 6 months straight, and the Reserve Bank here is on the warpath, having raised rates 50 points in both April and May, and widely expected to continue raising rates at double speed. And now, of course, our market is toying up with whether they're going to start raising rates at triple speed here too. Can't rule it out, because if it's priced, if the market's expecting it, then it just automatically becomes the path of least resistance. But the Reserve Bank here was quicker off the mark, since they started raising rates already in October last year. And there's no question they're getting traction when you look at what's happening to the housing market. Consumer confidence is on the floor. Business confidence is holding up better, but but nonetheless, there are clearly firms are quite concerned about what these sharp interest rate increases and the slowing housing market is going to do to the demand side of the economy. But at the moment, businesses are mostly concerned about the supply side, and that does include regulatory challenges in the environmental space, particularly for agriculture. That's been playing on their minds for a very long time now. But there's a lot of other supply challenges too. In particular, the shortage of labour is extreme, and it started in construction, but it really has broadened across the whole economy. So firms are telling us that finding labour is their number one problem, and you can see it when you walk down the street. Cafes are saying, "Sorry, we closed today, lack of staff," or "Sorry about our terrible customer service in advance because we're short of staff. Please bear with us." You can see it, and of course, agriculture again has been particularly prone to that because of the seasonality of those jobs. Why would you take a seasonal job that you've got to uproot yourself to another region and then move again, and when there's so much choice? The labour market has never been so tight. If you just take a measure of the number of job ads being advertised divided by the number of people who are unemployed, for example, it's just off the chart. We have a record high labour force participation rate, which makes sense because the cost of living is so high with inflation running at 7%. It's pretty hard to balance the household budget on one income at the moment. So people are looking for work, but they've found it, and it's the closed border basically. Our reliance on imported labour has abruptly been exposed, and that's really been across the board: hospitality, retail, agriculture, construction, manufacturing, you name it. We've just become accustomed to plugging the holes with imported workers. Now, of course, the border's supposed to open at the end of July, but there is, of course, in the meantime, a bit of a drain going on to Australia, which is also suffering labour shortages and has a higher wage level than New Zealand does. So, and we've got 3 years worth of OEs queued up. And the government has announced a rebalancing of immigration, which, although it has a green path for some highly skilled workers, overall we'd call it a tightening of immigration policy. So it's not at all clear that labour supply shortages are going to be addressed from the supply side anytime soon. So of course the Reserve Bank is aiming to reduce labour demand. In their forecast they showed the unemployment rate rising to nearly 5%, and that is a feature, not a bug, of tightening monetary policy. They are deliberately trying to slow the economy in order to get inflation down, to get wage pressure down. But it's a bit of a hard comms sell because it's been so long since the Reserve Bank has had to do a tightening cycle like this and deliberately try and slow the economy that it just seems outrageous, so mean, such a horrible thing to do. And the extra challenge, that's always the case with monetary policy tightenings, but it's just the symmetric side of the cycle. But the challenge this time is that quite a lot of the inflation pressure is coming from offshore, from oil prices, for example, but also food prices as well, and that's been exacerbated by the situation in Ukraine. But essentially that type of inflation is bad for growth in and of itself. And so essentially to get on top of that inflation, you have to kick the economy when it's down. And so that's why equity markets in the US, for example, are not happy, because that's not a great situation for firms' outlook for earnings. If you've got high oil prices and that's going to be hitting demand, and then the Reserve Bank is trying to lower demand even further. But this is, of course, the reason that central banks were made independent in the late 80s. New Zealand was a trailblazer in that regard. It's so that they would do the unpopular hard thing when this sort of situation happened, and ensure that we did get on top of inflation and maintain price stability in the medium term. Because essentially, if you don't do the hard yards now, then you can end up in a situation where inflation is truly embedded in people's expectations and people's wage demands. And then you actually require a 1991 type recession to get on top of it, which is double-digit unemployment. That was just a horrendous time for the economy, and no one wants to be in that boat again. So they're playing the long game. But of course, central banks don't need to get re-elected, and governments do. So that's the challenge. Governments all around the world are being blamed for inflation, whether they're left governments or right governments. Everyone blames the government. So that's been a very fruitful ground for opposition parties all over the world. So politicians at the moment are on board with rate hikes insofar as they want inflation fixed as well. But as the actual impacts of those rate hikes start to feed through into economies and businesses and households start to do it even tougher, you would expect those rate hikes to become more political, because you're talking about people's well-being, and it's a difficult starting point essentially for central banks. They don't want to cause recessions, but they are willing to take the risk of doing that, because a recession now, which brings about price stability, would be a much better outcome in the long run than making sure we don't go into recession now, but then inflation keeps ratcheting up, and then you're in an even worse position in the medium term. As Powell, the Adrian Orr equivalent in the US, put it, without price stability, you can't have maximum sustainable employment in the long run. So yeah, we're playing the long game here. And I guess in a way that's what climate policy is all about as well. But when households are already under so much cost of living pressure, wages are going to catch up, but they're not there yet. So in the meantime, most people are suffering from real wage cuts at the moment, not feeling particularly well off. And if they own a house, that's going backwards in value. So the wealth effect is working backwards as well. That's a pretty challenging environment for them to then basically impose more costs on businesses and on households. But we've got to play the long game. So that's just a little bit of the political and economic backdrop for what the government is trying to do in the carbon space. And perhaps that's a good place for me to leave it. And I'll hand back to Lorraine to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Sharon. And yeah, it is a difficult environment at the moment, and I guess one of the things you touched on is the way that rates are rising at the moment, and that's kind of really key for businesses in this current environment. So while the message isn't, I don't think it's one that we really warm to at the moment. I guess the thing I think about when you're running a business at the moment, you've got those challenges of labour and supply chain, but when it comes to rate and the rate environment, they are, it's creeping up rapidly, which is not something we're used to. So, when I think about businesses, the key is to have a good risk profile of your debt, and make sure you have it spread across various years, or actually think about what you can do in that space with your position. But look, thanks very much, Sharon. When we think about everything that's impacting businesses from an economic point of view, we also need to consider climate change impacts and how businesses can best prepare for that. So the first emissions reduction plan sets the scene for how New Zealand will meet our carbon budget and targets to decarbonise the New Zealand economy. So to help us unpack this area, I'm really delighted to have Steve Dixon with us here today. So Steve joined ANZ at the end of last year as an ESG specialist for us, working with our teams on climate change education. Steve joined us from Toitu EnviroCare, where he was the General Manager for Strategy and Partnership, and he's got a really long career in helping businesses and governments reduce their carbon and environmental impacts. So Steve, I'll hand over to you to share your insights on the first emissions reduction plan and what impacts and opportunities you see for businesses to help them prepare for the future.
Okay, thanks Lorraine, and morena everybody. Look, it's my unenviable job to try and summarise a 380-page document with 70 pages of actions alone in about 15 minutes. So we're going to have a go at that. So I want to start with a little summary of where the ERP, or the emissions reduction plan, sits across all of the pieces of the puzzle, all of the legislation and key mechanisms that the government has in place. I'll then have a look at some of the scope and scale of this document. So it's a huge undertaking to basically redirect the economy towards a low emissions direction transition over the next 15 years, starting with this first budget, which covers the first 3 years of that cycle. Then we'll look into 3 specific areas or sectors where there is significant change indicated and significant funding. And then we'll have a broader look at implications. All right, so let's have a look at the bigger picture. So at the top there is the Zero Carbon Act, which sets our targets and established the Climate Change Commission. This was put in place in 2019. So that's really set the legislative platform for things like the ERP. So it legislates for the delivery by the government of this emissions reduction plan. It's required. It's also required that the Climate Change Commission, which is our independent reviewer, undertakes a review of the ERP and basically assesses whether or not it will deliver to the targets that the government set itself. And you'll be familiar with these targets. So we have a net zero carbon target for 2050, excluding methane. There are different targets for methane, which is a different conversation. And alongside that, we have some significant review and update of the emissions trading scheme. So the emissions trading scheme now has a proper cap on it. It now has an auction system. There was an auctions took place yesterday, setting the price at around about $76, so no significant change from there. And then you have the emissions reduction plan, which is really setting the pathway, putting out the plans and policies that the government believes are going to be required to hit those targets in the Zero Carbon Act. He Waka Kanoa is a specific agricultural policy and direction set by the sector itself with alignment with government. The government received that last week and will report back on that at the end of the year. So basically that's setting what the pricing mechanism the sector believes will work to begin to bring down agricultural emissions. And then the final part of the puzzle is the adaptation planning, which is sort of underway. It's not needed as urgently as some of the mitigation and immediate reductions, but it's certainly an important part of the puzzle, and that work is also ongoing. So I see the ERP as the last piece of the legislative and policy puzzle that the government needed to put together. So what's in it? It's the first of 3 plans. So it covers the years 2022 to 2025. A second ERP will begin to be developed in 2023, and we'll probably see it at the end of that year. And that will cover the second budget period between 25 and 30. The time up to 2030 is really important because the government set a CO2 target of a reduction of 50% by 2030, which is a big ask. It's a challenging ask. So this first period is important, but certainly the second period between 2025 and 30 is very important if we're going to hit those targets. So it covers all sectors of the economy. Agriculture is obviously touched on and it's funded, but a lot of the agricultural direction will come out of the He Waka Kanoa decisions, but all other sectors of the economy are touched on in some way by this plan. It's depth and breadth all over. A lot of money's gone towards this, so the government has put aside the emissions trading scheme auction funding. They had about $4.5 billion available. They've spent just over $3 billion of that in a combination of the ERP specific spending and a little bit of budget spending that they announced, which was the continuation of the half price public transport for a little while longer and half price for community service card holders and the like. So the impact of the plan is estimated to be between 5.4 and 11.9 megatons, which is millions of tons of reduced CO2 over the 3-year period of the budget. So that's around about between 2 and 4% of our total emissions per annum being taken off. And I guess this is through COVID, we got very used to hearing about the sort of the bending the curve. This is our curve to focus on for the next 3 decades. Bending that carbon curve is going to become an ongoing conversation and target for government. The reason for the breadth in those emissions is really about the degree of uptake that the economy has of the various incentives and policies the government's put in place. So there's quite a lot of breadth depending on the speed of uptake and movement of the economy and business. So a significant theme of the ERP is it chose to take a partnership approach. The government could have taken a very compliance or regulative approach to getting where it feels that we need to go as an economy. but it took a very different approach. It took very much a partnership or a carrot rather than stick approach for this. And you see that throughout the emissions reduction plan, but particularly in what they call the Government Investment and Decarbonisation of Industry Fund, which is thankfully shortened to GIDI for everybody else. And the GIDI fund is a significant fund of over $600 million to support businesses to take out major emitting aspects of their business. So that's largely boilers, coal boilers and gas fed boilers. So that's our process heat, which is a co-funding mechanism, which I'll talk more about in a moment. The car social licensing scheme, we don't know a lot about it, but it's really about a significant fund of money, over $500 million, towards taking out the old clunkers, so the high emitting vehicles out of our fleet, and replacing them with presumably electric or low emissions vehicles. The Agricultural Research Fund is a collaboration with the agricultural sector to target the options or to increase the number of options that the sector has to reduce emissions. It's well known that for that particular sector, which is nearly half of our emissions nationally, they've got a reasonably limited toolbox of things they can do on farm to reduce emissions. You can play with your fertilizer, you can do some management of on farm management approaches, you can destock to a degree, but without hitting the economics of your farming hard, there's pretty limited options at the moment. So that research fund is about targeting those inhibitors, those vaccines, the genetics, and there's other approaches. And finally, this commercialization of those products is all important, so getting them out to farm. So that's the partnership approach that the government has chosen to take here. And of course, there's a lot of money going in the direction of these policies. So this is this incentive approach writ large. And you can see here the biggest spending areas. So overall, transport's receiving over $1 billion, $1.3 billion in various forms. The improving vehicle fleet is this cash for clunkers scheme. But there's public transport support, there's mode shift, which is really about getting people onto buses, trains and bikes and out of their vehicles. And then it's been a little bit under the radar, but forestry received a significant chunk of money as well. And as mentioned, agriculture received a good chunk, and also under the radar was this $100 million towards organics waste collection in all of our major cities and metropolitans. So that's a significant shift of a major waste stream that's generating methane in our landfills. So that's $100 million towards supporting local government to get curbside organic collection happening across the country. It's happening in a small number of places now. This is a massive scale up of that. And finally, the GIDI fund at the bottom there with the biggest chunk of all. So you can see with the spend here where the government believes it can start to really bend the curve. So transport is one of the areas where they have the most significant influence and ability to start to take that 20% of our total emissions and start to curb it down. So there's a lot of spend in that space. Forestry, the funding there is all about filling the gap between where we need to be to reach our targets and what we think we can achieve in the meantime. And so that's about building sequestration, a backlog of sequestration to absorb carbon where we can't yet reduce it. So looking now at three particular sectors. So industries, I've mentioned the GIDI fund. This fund is a unique little fund in that it targets, uses a methodology based on marginal abatement costs, which basically means if you're in an industry with a significant emissions and you believe that you can reduce those emissions, but you need support to make the business case with some government money to do it, basically a subsidy. These subsidies come usually in the form of grants rather than loans. You're most likely to get the money if you have the lowest cost per tonne of carbon that you can avoid. So it's really based on an economics approach to taking out the easiest to reach, the low-hanging fruit carbon out of industry. So that's, again, the process heat, but it's going to be a much more significant fund. It's 10 times the scale of what it is currently, but it's also going to be available for some of the very large projects that we have, so over $5 million projects, but also it's going to be broader, so a wider network of substitution technologies are going to be funded. There's a few sort of policies and frameworks being developed in the next 3 years as well as part of the ERP. So there a regulatory framework for offshore renewable energy, which is primarily wind, but you'll see some things in there around tidal, more than likely. A roadmap for developing the use of hydrogen. This is really significant if we're going to reduce freight emissions. We need a hydrogen network to support that. There's quite a lot of work going on in industry already, and there's quite a number of early movers who are moving in that space. But this is about the government supporting that with a regulatory framework to make it easier. And then the renewable energy strategy is really about a roadmap to get us to nearly 100% renewable energy in the future. I've covered agriculture to a degree. That's that research fund that I mentioned, nearly 340 million. 35 million is for on-farm support, is really about getting farm advisors out into farms to support farmers to start to make those reductions on farm. Not waiting for some silver bullets in the future, but actually getting on farm now and starting farmers to support them to do what's available for them to do now to reach those initial targets. In the forestry space, you see over $250 million towards scaling up native forestry planting. And then this $90 million for the biomass forest, the 10,000 hectares, is about how to support the GIDI fund. As the GIDI fund takes out gas and coal boilers, they'll largely be replaced by biomass boilers. And those biomass boilers need fuel and they need it nearby. So those 10,000 hectares of forests, I'd expect, are about filling gaps where we don't have biomass fuel readily available, and into the future as the demand for that increases, as we have more biomass boilers running all over the country, fueling industry. So that's what that's about. That's kind of a little bit of forward thinking to manage the potential scale as we start to change out technologies and shift and transition away from carbon intensive. And then finally in the transport space, so what's significant here, as much as the money is huge, 1.3 billion, is actually the targets themselves. So you'll see here, they want to increase zero emissions vehicles to 30% of the light fleet by 2035. So in 13 years, we're currently at between 1% and 2% of electric vehicles in our fleet. They want that to be 30% by 2035. So there's going to be more than the mechanisms available now to shift us in that direction. I think the economics of EVs are already starting to shift people anyway. They don't necessarily need substantial subsidies going forward, but that is a significant target to get us to that place. And then overall vehicle kilometres in the light fleet reduced by 20%. So that is mode shift. That's getting people onto buses and trains and bikes. And then the freight emissions target, which is, again, hasn't been widely talked about, but that's a significant target, 35% reduction in emissions from freight by 2035. So that's increasing the use of train freight, increasing the use of coastal shipping, but also alternative fuels. So biofuels for trucking is already available and possible, and the infrastructure is largely in place. It's about scaling that up, but then it's about electrics and hydrogen, as already mentioned. So that's a significant target, and it feels like a long way away just now. But that's the headline where the government wants us to head. Zero emissions buses only coming into the fleet from 2025. That's a no-brainer. They're economic on the go. You don't need a subsidy for most of that. And then the entire public transport fleet decarbonised by 2035. So that's about exiting out of diesel buses and potentially diesel trains and the like in due course. I won't go into the funding. We've sort of talked about the scale of that already. So to wrap up, what are the implications for businesses out there? It's already a tough time. And I think, the reason the ERP takes an incentives-based approach and provides subsidies and support for businesses to transition is because, taxing and regulating and forcing compliance is really not neither a good look or probably a very effective way of starting to transition business right now. So what you will see for all businesses post 2025, when agriculture is part of the emissions pricing scheme, either through HEWOC Economist or in the ETS itself, you're going to see a price for carbon built into pretty much everything in the economy. And that price is $76 a tonne right now, but it's expected to be $100 a tonne by 2020 based on the Climate Change Commission's assessment, and you'll see that price continuing to rise. And so that price will be built, it's already built into your fuels, it's already built into your electricity. You'll see it in pretty much everything you buy and everything you drive going forward. So it's going to become a more significant component of your business cases as you choose options in your businesses around what you want to do and how you want to fuel what it is you do. As mentioned, lots of incentives out there for business out of the ERP. So there's lots of support and wraparound for businesses. And in particular, there's many more places to go for advice and support than there used to be. So MB has a whole bunch of schemes and advice and knowledge on its website. If you go to biz.gov, you'll see kind of a whole starter pack of things that you can look at. ECA, the Energy Efficiency Conservation Authority, they also have a whole bunch of support for business. So there's lots of things already in place. The ERP just accelerates that and provides actual, real cash for businesses that are making significant shifts out of carbon intensive business practices. But the other thing underlying all of this, so it's not just about what the government requires of us all as far as a nation to hit these targets. Consumers are already asking these questions. They're already challenging businesses to change the way they do things. So when people are asked, there's an annual survey by Kantar of New Zealanders' environmental attitudes. When they're asked this year, 86% said that they want to see more action on climate change. And when they were asked how they, were intending to purchase, in Auckland, 47% of customers said that they wanted to purchase based on their values, and their values were about reducing the impacts of climate change and doing their part. So businesses are already seeing those effects. You see those effects when you walk into any supermarket and you look at the number of options that are available now that weren't available before, different types of milk, different types of proteins and so forth. And you see it in the EVs, you see it on your roads, and you'll begin to see it more and more. So this is really being driven from the bottom up by customers now, much more so than requiring the government to set the direction. But the government's got an important role to play, and that is the ERP's kind of setting that direction and framework for us all to operate within. And my final comment is that, this is the first ERP, but as I've mentioned, the second ERP is going to be carrying a huge load. So this one, best case scenario by 2025, we've taken 4% off our total of our emissions per annum. We need to get to 50% for CO2 by 2030. So that second ERP is going to be carrying a lot of weight, and you'll see, I think, an increasing degree of policies and programs and the like to kind of drive action. So that's that for me.
Thanks, Steve. That's been fascinating for me. I didn't get to the bottom of the document. It is a very lengthy document, so I think it's been really useful to have that summary of the initiatives included in this plan and what it means for some of our key sectors. So I think, like all of you here at ANZ, we're planning for a future where climate and environmental responsibility is central to our business. While there's no immediate ready-made solutions, I think our sustainable decision-making is governed by probably 4 key areas, reduce our impact, help our customers, finance the transition, and support our communities. So I'd really encourage you all to be clear about your own long-term priorities. Talk with your leadership teams and staff about taking, practical action to reduce your emissions, engage the support of experts, and take those steps to future-proof your business. There's no one size fits all, I don't think, but we can help our regional managers and our bankers are here to understand your business plan and the financing solutions that make sense. We've got Steve on board, and he's certainly helping our team get a much stronger sense of what needs to be done. But look, we did say we'd dive into some questions, and we've had quite a few questions. So we might kick off. Sharon, the first one I've got is actually for you. I think you're back there, yes. Is there a link between the government's climate policy and the units issued for the emissions trading scheme and the revenue earned from the ETS?
Yeah, so the emission trading scheme will generate some revenue, but it really is a byproduct. The main point of a trading scheme is what Steve talked about, that those who can reduce their emissions most cheaply, those with the low-hanging fruit, have a strong incentive, while for those for whom it's much more difficult and costly in terms of growth and jobs and dollars, perhaps come a bit later, or we can just get that efficiency going. There will obviously be some revenue generated. It's a little bit undermined by the fact that they've given away so many credits to try and ease the burden on industry and on the broader economy a little bit. But that revenue is mostly just getting ploughed back into environmental initiatives. So it's not like it's a real pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for the government, that they can spend that money on whatever they like. The actual revenue is pretty small beer, I would say, in the larger scheme of things. While the emission trading scheme is very important, it's not going to fix the problem on its own, which is of course why there's so much more in that document than just the trading scheme.
Great, thanks, Sharon. Steve, I've got one for you. How can we ensure we develop and recruit the right skills in the workforce for our transition?
Yes, well, Sharon has already noted the extreme shortage of talent across the board, across pretty much all industries, and it's the same in the decarbonisation space. So recently I read from one of the big engineering consultancies that they believe they're short about 1,000 engineers to support businesses to transition in this space, particularly to shift out of boilers. So I think we're going to need both local development, so universities targeting this, and I know the likes of the University of Canterbury are targeting this across all their engineering courses now, but also we're going to need some support from immigration probably to bring the talent in to enable us to transition as quickly as we want. But of course, that's in the context of every other country in the world also wanting to transition at the same time. So it's a tough space. So we really have to support our local people. That's where the real talent's going to come from, and that's where I think the government and the universities and the polytechs need to step up and really support people as quickly as we can.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Hey, and one other one. Is there anything in the plan that small business owners can embrace so they can do something positive to help with the emission reductions plan?
Yes, there is. So I mentioned that there's already a bunch of existing support out there with ECA and MB, and a whole bunch of tools that didn't exist 10 years ago for small businesses. I think the likes of the cash for clunkers and the EV subsidies are there for small business, but also the GIDI fund, because it's been broadened so significantly. If you are a small business, you may only have a small amount of emissions, but there might be options in that fund going forward. Probably not first cab off the rank, but in a couple of years, I'd expect that they'll broaden that fund significant enough to enable maybe some small businesses to get some benefit from it.
Mm.
You know, the reality, however, is that the government is targeting big emitters right now. You know, it knows there's a bunch of coal boilers out there. It knows that there's a significant sort of freight weight of emissions out there. So that's where it wants to target its initial approach. But over time, we'll start to see branching out and government support for a much wider sector of the economy.
Yeah. There's we've had a question around how might the emissions reduction plan affect the assessment of risks in commercial real estate, and will it impact the available structure and conditionality of debt funding? So I think the ERP's provided more clarity on how New Zealand's climate change goals will impact people and business across every sector. And we can see emissions reduction in buildings becoming increasingly important to landlords and head tenants in the future. So climate change and I think the need for environmental resilience are a growing part of our conversations with customers. And that's why we're committed to dealing, to kind of delivering insights like this event. We know businesses will need to transition over time, and we all need to look at the long term, which is nothing new for us. Our commitment, including the way that we support customers to identify climate risk, to take action to reduce their emissions, and to help finance those transitions. And that's the commitment we've really signed up for in terms of the changing environment we're working in. Steve, there's another question here asking where native plants come into the scheme. Can you touch on that for us?
Sure. As you will have noted from the presentation, there's $250 million going into planting natives. So that's a significant part of the solution, to absorb the carbon that we can't currently avoid through other approaches. But we also know that there's a real shortage of native nurseries right now. There basically aren't enough plants available for people at the scale that they want to plant. So there's quite a lot of, there's a significant mention inside the plan of supporting those nurseries to expand. So I think government is targeting that area. They've already done that with the exotic forest side as part of the 1 billion trees program in the first 3 years of this government. I think we're now seeing a real targeting of that native space because that's seen as a long-term permanent sequestration, not to be logged and certainly not to be left untended, but to be supported to absorb carbon over generations rather than a 30-year life cycle of an exotic tree.
Yeah. Sounds like a possible business opportunity for expansion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Hey, look, there's a question here. If there is room for a rebate to businesses investing in solar, which will help reduce load on the grid, making room for all the EV chargers.
Yeah, look, solar's interesting. It's almost not mentioned in the ERP. So over 360 plus pages, there's very little mention of solar. And I've been wondering about that. I think there's probably one primary reason, which is that the government feels that the commercial case for solar has been made. So for the gentailers, they're rolling out over 500 megawatts of new solar over the next 3 years across the country in different places. There's Christchurch Airport's putting solar next door to the airport there. There's a suite of new solar fields going in the North Island, near to where it's going to be used. So I think they feel that the commercial case is being made. Domestic solar is increasing by 20% a year. So I kind of feel that when they looked across the board of where they can get bang for buck for funding and rebates and subsidies, they kind of thought actually the case for solar domestically and commercially is pretty much there now. I was talking to a farmer recently who put solar on his milking shed and on a packing shed for some horticulture he does. That's going to pay itself off in 6 years. Following that, it's pretty much free energy. So I think that's why you don't see a lot of it in the ERP. But it might be that there's something in the remaining kind of $1 billion that the government has up its sleeve in this space. But right now, it was interesting to me that solar was just not there. They were definitely targeting elsewhere as far as the first ERP.
Yeah. We've got another question, which I'm not sure, maybe Sharon, you want to touch on this a little bit as well, but you've touched on it a bit, Steve, but how will enough electricity be produced to enable the EVs and other electric transport options to be to get charged? I don't know.
My area of expertise. Happy for you to take that one, Steve.
So you're going to have to repeat it, Lorraine. I was reading a very interesting question on the side.
So how will enough electricity be produced to enable the EVs and other electric transport options to get charged? Yeah,
and this is a good and common question. So right now, under the Climate Change Commission, when it did an initial assessment of how we would reach our targets, they had made an assumption that we'd be closing Tiwai Point, the smelter, which takes 13 to 40% of our total energy. They're now shifting from that assumption, or at least away from the assumption of the smelter closing in the next couple of years, which seems unlikely given the price of aluminium right now. And so even despite that, the government believes that because new generation for wind and solar is coming on stream quite quickly, that they're not particularly concerned about meeting the requirements. If the economy moves faster than expected, then we might have some issues. But as I understand it, we're already at 91% renewables over the last quarter. So we've got away from a really poor year last year where we were using a lot of coal and a lot of gas for a variety of reasons. And we're currently in a pretty good place. There's more and more renewables going in. Geothermal is an absolute godsend and is supporting a lot of base load where it wasn't before. So I think, look, the future looks reasonably bright, literally, in that space. I think we shouldn't worry too much, and it shouldn't be a reason that we don't invest in commercial scale heat pumps and the like, because I think the energy will be there at a price that we can afford.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. One for you, Sharon. As we price carbon into everything we do, how do we see this impacting on equality issues, the low wage environment, the high level of imports and potential government responses to address this? It's a big question.
Probably write a book on that. But yeah, no, it is a real issue because energy is obviously a necessity, and it's one that's under upward. Someone needs to mute themselves. Under upward pressure already. And of course, increases in the price of necessities do hit the lowest income people the hardest. So there is definitely a role for government to play here. Directly subsidising carbon-based fuel is obviously counterproductive in terms of our carbon goals. So it would be better if it was just straight income support, essentially. So I would expect that to be an issue. Just more generally, global inflation has been trending down for so long. We're so used to imports getting cheaper and cheaper. That is now questionable, I would say, but partly because of climate change, not just mitigation strategies, but the actual impacts of climate change. It seems every year some major growing region is either in drought or flood. And unfortunately, the forecasts are for that to become the new normal. That's a win for New Zealand insofar as we produce more food than we can eat, but obviously a negative for humanity, and also it does suggest higher inflation, therefore higher interest rates. So I suspect we're at least going back to the 1990s world in terms of where inflation being a problem you need to have to keep solving, as opposed to something you have to lovingly nurture. And climate change and the policies around that are part of that, along with geopolitics and deglobalization potentially as well. So that is a different world, and it also suggests that wages would need to average higher as well. Inflation targets themselves may come into question. How hard do you want to pummel your domestic economy to offset high imported inflation or high energy prices that are for carbon reasons, for example? So there's going to be a lot of debate as this one goes on, I would say.
Just directly in the ERP, there's a couple of things supporting kind of the equity issues, which are well known, and that's about home insulation. So grants for home insulation and home heating and energy efficient home heating, which will reduce power prices for households, and also this cash for clunkers scheme. So that's very much directed at people who are driving old high emitting vehicles who tend to be in the lower socioeconomic, kind of the poorer end of town. And so that's a direct subsidy to support those people to get out of those vehicles, which will obviously, if they move to EV or low emitting vehicles, they're likely to be much more fuel efficient, equaling a significant saving for those households. So there's a little bit of incentive in there within the ERP in a couple of specific areas, but certainly plenty to do.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Sharon. Hey, look, we've got quite a few more questions, but I'm really conscious we are out of time. There's one question I might just very, very quickly touch on, which will ANZ cut back lending support towards non-renewable energy businesses, i.e. petrol stations? I think the key that we've talked about a lot today is that it's about the transition to a better future for New Zealand. It's about the transitioning of businesses to more sustainable business practices, and that's how we're playing alongside the climate change requirements that New Zealand has as a country. And our real focus is about how do we help businesses transition. It's not about us saying we'll stop doing anything. We will definitely work towards the transition, just like you all are. But look, hey, massive thank you to our speakers, Sharon and Steve, this morning. Thanks for everyone for taking the time to join us this morning. We hope you found the session really useful.